This is Chatter. I'm Shane Harris. This week, journalist Alyssa Rosenberg on spy movies and the Oscars.
I think the best spy stories get at the fact that there is something sort of fundamentally immoral about the work.
Yeah. You know, it is stealing, it's cheating, it's lying, it's deception.
The assassination of bin Laden, like, it was a story that was sort of entwined with Hollywood from the beginning, right? Like, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson breaks the story nationally. He knew a bunch of Marines and he tweeted it.
God, I forgot that. Yeah. That's wild.
I would love to see someone make a geopolitical horror movie about a foreign power that creates an app that it uses to poison an entire country's brains, right? Like, TikTok is horror movie is like an obvious techno thriller, right?
Alyssa Rosenberg, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so happy you're here.
I know. This is like, I mean, it's both a throwback and a look forward.
I know.
Very
I like
exciting.
it. This is very good. This is very good. We both like to pod, but we've never podded together.
I know. And it's like, we work together. We had drinks together.
Yeah.
But it's like, I feel like this is the 2023 sign of intimacy, right? It's like, have you podded together?
I like that. I'm going to go with that theme for the year. That's very good. So for those of you who don't know Alyssa, she is a writer at the opinion section at the Washington Post, where she writes about culture. She writes about pop culture, mass culture. She writes about parenting. She writes about gender. You have a very nice wide portfolio.
It's super fun.
Yeah. So we're going to talk today about the Oscars. We're going to talk about spy movies and the Oscars. Before we get to the Oscars, though, tell the audience a little bit about yourself. We go way back, but tell us, go back before, go back to the Alyssa origin story, before we get to the Shane Alyssa origin story.
So,
where'd you grow up?
I grew up all over New England. I was born in Connecticut. My family moved to Vermont when I was 7 and Massachusetts when I was 11. And I actually had my first job, the one that, made me the woman I am today, starting when I was 8 years old in Vermont, where my mother signed me up to write book reviews for the children's page of the local paper. They paid me in gift certificates to the local bookstore, which was just an incredible boondoggle for everyone involved. Nice. The Kochs would have loved it, right? It's like their perfect vision of child labor. It's a really good thing the internet didn't exist, because my author photo featured me in like tiny pink glasses and a little lace ruff. Like,
you still have it?
Of course, I still have it.
You should use it.
No, some things will never see the light of day. But it's funny because I think I was always sort of interested in journalism, and I had this job. But it took me a while to figure out that I wanted to be in journalism. I would say well into my college career when I was doing a lot of activist work, but I was also writing a column about city politics for the student newspaper. And I took a writing class taught by Linda Peterson. And it's one of the sort of classic classes at Yale where I went to school. And it's called Daily Themes. And she said at the beginning of the class that this is the perfect test of whether or not you want to be a writer, because the course is exactly as the title suggests. You have to sit down and turn in an assignment every weekday of the entire semester.
Wow.
And it's competitive. There are 120 people in the class, all submitting 5 essays a week. And then the section leaders would get together with the professor and pick a couple essays to be read every week.
Oh, my God.
So it's brutal, right? I mean,
it's exactly what a bunch of type A overachieving Ivy League undergrads need to develop.
100%. But it's like if you're a competitive reporter at a major paper, it's the competition for A1, right?
Precisely.
And so, that was the question. Do you like writing every day when it's terrible, when you're assigned to write on one of the themes where you have no idea, no inspiration? The section leaders were really, really tough on us, and I loved it. I just loved it. And I interned at The Atlantic the summer before my senior year, and then came down to D.C. to work as the fact checker at National Journal, which is where I met you. And I think I was not even a week out of college.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a baby.
Were you excited to be coming to DC and like working in journalism in Washington? I mean, did it feel like this kind of arrival for you, or was it more happenstance?
That's interesting. I mean, I think I was glad to have a job in journalism, period. My parents had lived in D.C. in the 70s, and I actually ended up moving back to their old neighborhood, like literally a block or two from where they lived. And, look, I think DC was probably a good match for someone like me. It was, nerdy and earnest and, had never lived in a really big city. And so I was glad to have a job, and it turned out to be a really nice fit. And then just as it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do, broadly professionally, it took me a while to sort out what I was going to do in journalism. The fact-checking job was great because I sat down and read the entire magazine cover to cover every week.
And a very nerdy, wonky magazine, too.
Yes, yeah. National Journal, for those who are not familiar with it, was this incredible sort of policy and politics, really trade magazine, right? In a way that, doesn't really exist anymore.
That's right.
I don't even think something like Politico or Axios comes close to the depth or sort of usefulness.
It'd be like if Politico and Axios had a baby with The Economist.
Yeah,
kind of.
Yeah, but you had people who were reporting full time on agriculture, on subjects that were always going to be sort of marginal in the public attention, but that were vital for people who were making policy, who were sitting on the Ag Committee in Congress, who were doing the work of keeping the country running.
Was that intimidating as the fact checker? Because if you miss a fact, someone's going to see it.
It was terrifying. In my first week at the magazine, there was a columnist who shall remain nameless, who had a bunch of errors in a piece.
I know who this is.
And I had to go to Charlie Green, the editor, and be like, this is wrong, sir. And the columnist got really mad. And Charlie sided with me, and that was I really was nervous about being wrong.
Yeah.
But to be in a place that had that emphasis for, nobody is above the facts.
Right,
and
totally.
My understanding was that I was the first checker who got through the whole magazine on a regular basis.
Oh, wow,
because there was only one of us. It was really, it was an excellent copy desk. I learned a ton from people like Scott Rohr, who I worked with. But it was, it was a big, meaty publication. It was coming out weekly. It was a lot of very arcane stuff. And so it was a great opportunity to just dive into this sort of arcana. And from there, actually with your help, I moved over to Government Executive, another trade publication, which still exists and is vital for people who work in the federal government. Right. And I spent 3 years covering federal personnel policy, which, in some cases meant just racing the Washington Post to get, the scoop of what the federal pay raise was going to be in, 2007. This was all a while ago. But it also meant, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association leaked me a bunch of data on staffing at, the towers and TRACONs around the country. And we were able to demonstrate that those facilities were really understaffed in ways that were dangerous. And so, it was, I think the minute I got there, I knew that was not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. But developing those skills of, okay, you're going to sit in a House Government Affairs and Oversight Committee and listen to, Jerry Connolly get something done in between Darrell Issa pontificating about things. It was really valuable, right?
You see how the sausage gets made.
Well, but it also teaches you sort of patience and details and the virtue of, developing relationships. And, I would not be, where I am today without Anne Loren and Tom Shoup and that job. And so I'm incredibly grateful for it. But while I was there, I was thinking, okay, what do I want to do next? Right. And this was the days when you could start a blog for free on the internet and, figure out something that you wanted to do. So I started a blog about pop culture, a subject about which I knew very little. I actually grown up much more immersed in books than in pop culture. And so, I put myself on this sort of daily theme style writing schedules. Like I had to put up 3 posts a day. And, often it'd be like a music video with a couple lines of commentary. Or I watched this and it was weird. But it found a following. I actually met my best friend through the blog. She wrote something really mean about something I had written, and I got in touch with her. And I have a phone date with her today as we record this podcast. So, I found this rhythm and this voice and ended up taking that over to Think Progress when that site was still running. There was this ecosystem. I launched the blog while guest blogging for Matt Iglesias with Ta-Nehisi Coates. Again, this tells you
early days,
an earlier era of the internet. But there was this really nice sort of almost calling it I think the best way to describe it is sort of a link economy, right? I mean, people were sort of helping each other out, helping each other's things grow.
Right.
And so Matt helped bring me over to Think Progress, where I started a culture and then a spin-off sports section. And Fred Hyatt brought me over to the Washington Post opinion section in 2012. No, 2014.
It would have been like 14, right?
Yeah, it has to be. It has to be 2014. That's right.
But you're coming up on 10 years there, yeah.
Yeah, coming up on 10 years. And so it was a really interesting experience where, I was the only critic in the country working in an opinion section. And
is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I think there were people who wrote about culture periodically, like Maureen Dowd has always sort of dabbled in that beat. But I was the first person who's coming into it as, I'm a close reader of a text, and that's sort of what I do. And I do reporting on that ecosystem. And it's been just an incredible home for me ever since. And I've been writing more about parenting lately because I am a parent now. I have 2 kids under 5. They keep me very busy. One of them turned to me the other day and said, "Mommy, why can't we do crimes?" So they keep you on your toes. But it's also, I think, a really sort of interesting emergent policy area. There's a very rich culture of parenting, and so it's been sort of a natural but very interesting evolution.
So we'll be today diving in with your pop culture forte, which you have developed over the years. And one of the reasons I really was excited to talk to you about the Oscars and spy movies is, like you said, you are a very close reader of text. And there's just not that many critics who are also sort of performing that kind of function when they're watching a film, in addition to when they're reading a book, and you can just sort of bring a level of seriousness and interest to it, and you can watch how your mind is working on something.
Well, and I'm also a policy dork, right?
Yes, that too. Exactly.
And so it's, I have always been very interested in, not sort of these sort of crude questions like, is this accurate, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a whole genre of policy coverage of culture that's like, well, they didn't get the color of the elevator buttons on the 4th floor of Langley right, and that just proves they don't know what they're talking about, right? And that's never been that interesting to me, but over the years I've come to really appreciate culture as creating a space where it's possible to say things that are impermissible elsewhere in our political cultures. And so, something like Zero Dark Thirty is a movie that, is about the moral degradations of the war on terror and the sort of, an individual who embodies those degradations, right? And it's like in contemporary political discourse, there isn't a lot of room, for example, to talk about Lindy England and who she is as a person, or who is the person who oversaw Lindy England.
Right.
You actually get that what torture did to the people who committed it explored really well in Paul Schrader's The Card Counter, which I thought was one of the best movies I've seen in the last couple of years. Just unbelievable Oscar Isaac performance. And so culture, it's become a cliche to talk about people sort of holding space, but that's what culture does for us politically and intellectually. It creates space for us to feel things that we're not supposed to feel and say things that we're not supposed to say.
Right. So let's talk about this recent Oscars show, because there are 2 films that kind of hit on the broad themes of spying and security and some really interesting political dynamics, both from a film about a previous war and then some kind of imaginary war that we're in right now. I'm speaking of All Quiet on the Western Front and Top Gun Maverick, best movie of the year. So first
Lydia Tarr was robbed.
Okay, also a great movie. So what did you think of the show, first of all? I just want to know what you thought of the show.
I thought it was totally pleasant, right? Which is, sort of damning with faint praise, but considering that the Oscars have developed this reputation as, an entertaining train wreck, counts as an improvement. Like, when the closest you get to stepping over the line is like Cocaine Bear giving Malala a hard time.
That was a little cringy, but that was about it.
Yeah, but that woman handled herself beautifully.
Yeah.
As she does everything.
Yeah.
I thought Jimmy Kimmel was fine. Even more so than sort of Billy Crystal. He understands that his role is of a facilitator, right? He sets the scene, he sets the tone. But especially in a year like this, where there was a really lovely narrative, coming into it of people, being recognized who had not previously gotten their due in the entertainment industry, of people coming back after having gotten sort of lost in the wilderness. He did a really nice job of making sure that tone could persist, right? Yeah. And it helped that there were no colossal logistical snafus.
Right.
But, it was like a perfectly nice ceremony.
Yeah.
And in a weird way, that's like, I think that requires a mental recalibration.
I think so too. And it felt to me like I loved it. I thought it was the best show in years. It felt, frankly, the way, and this makes me sound like I'm going to date myself, the way the Oscars used to be.
Yeah.
When it was, it was charming, it was good natured. The jokes were, some of them were kind of pointed, but they weren't meant to wound.
Yeah.
Which was such a departure, obviously, from last year, where the whole slap thing just became, both a kind of tasteless joke that then just escalated so wildly into violence. Which, by the way, it was interesting to me that he leaned into that moment so many times. I thought he would just leave it to the Chris Rock special to have the last word on that, and he just kept returning to it as a motif, which I loved.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by that?
Yeah, and I wasn't sure. I'm not sure it was like the strongest bit of the.
Yeah, they were okay.
Right?
They were fine.
I think the L. Ron Hubba Hubba joke.
That was tense.
Yeah.
About Tom Cruise.
Well, and the fact, I have to say, I think it is a shame that Cruise didn't show up to the ceremony.
Yes.
And maybe he is in the process of jumping motorcycles off cliffs or something for Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning. But on a movie like that, where you're not nominated, even where the movie's not going to win Best Picture, you show up for your technical people who are nominated, right?
I was surprised he didn't show up because
Especially,
it did win an Oscar.
And especially given the attention, that he likes to draw to the below the line process, right?
Yes.
So I thought that was less tasteful than I find him to be solely in matters of sort of promoting the below-the-line craftsmen who make his work possible.
Well, particularly when Top Gun Maverick kind of is being embraced as the movie that saved the cinema post-COVID.
Yeah. Show up and get your dues, man.
Exactly.
Right?
I was really stunned that he didn't sort of like take the victory lap. Well, that movie is a great jumping off point to talk about some themes that I want to explore with you. And, two kind of big ideas for me emerged thinking about Top Gun Maverick, which I just loved, and I think everybody had a great time watching it in the theater. And like Top Gun was a very formative movie for me as a kid, both because I wanted to be a fighter pilot and when I saw the men playing volleyball with their shirts off, and it was like, whoo, both these things are interesting. So it just looms huge in the public consciousness. And to your point about culture being this like space that we create, it's got a mythology around it. But one, it had a lot of controversy going in because the movie was edited to be more amenable to basically Chinese censorship so that it could show in Chinese movie theaters, which are a huge part of the market. And the other is that the villain is never really specified, right? It's just sort of like North Chiranistan.
Yes,
right?
the fill in the blank Istan, which honestly is a convention in more action movies than you would think.
Is
right?
that because of the Chinese sensitivities?
Well, I think it's not
the
just
sensitivities about China.
I think it's not just the Chinese sensitivities. I think it's the internationalization of the movie market, right? It's not only do you not want to get yourself kicked out of any given potential market by saying like you're the bad guys. It leaves everyone free to project their sort of nationalist prejudices into who the bad guy is, right? And you never see the faces of any of the fighter pilots either. You don't have a sense of who the leadership is.
Visors. Yeah.
They're just bad. They're just the bad guys.
Yeah.
And so, I think that is both very convenient for the entertainment industry's increasingly global bottom line. But it, to a certain extent, it also speaks to contemporary American security culture where, in the wake of 9/11, all of a sudden it's like, well, this area is really strategically important. Like, there's, people from this acronymed group, popping up in this part of the Horn of Africa, and now we're really concerned about that, right? I think it's driven much more by Hollywood's economics, but don't you think it's sort of accidentally a real reflection of the sort of confusingness of U.S. foreign policy in a non-great power era?
I think so, because if you look at, Top Gun was such a binary. We were fighting the Soviets, right? And it was the MiGs, and it was all clear from the beginning, and it was this complete construct that everybody who saw that movie understood. And while nuclear weapons never come into play, which was sort of an interesting facet because that movie comes out at a very fevered point in the Cold War, it was us fighting the Russians, and we understood that. Whereas you're right, this movie, you could make the creative argument for making it a vague enemy, even if there weren't all of the international market sensitivities, precisely for that reason, because it kind of captures the threat of rogue states, the threat of rogue nuclear weapons, things we can't see, things that are really hard to detect, places that are really hard to go, all of the contours about the war on terror and the sort of post 9/11 kind of asymmetric environment where cyberspace gets into this too, where it's not just we can fight the Russians, we can dogfight them and win. It's all of these variables are in play, which I kind of loved how, in the movie, they set it up, right, as this crazy obstacle course he has to go through where it could fail at every point.
Well, and that's also very video game inspired, right?
Inspired, right.
But it's also interesting that it's a movie that attempts to argue both for American technical superiority and for the superiority of American human capital, right?
Yeah.
Because it's ultimately the human skill and a training program that brings in an idiosyncratic group of people and makes sure that they have the same sort of knowledge base and instinct base, but can just deploy it in their own ways.
Yeah.
That's more is the decisive factor.
Because they have to bring in Tom Cruise too as sort of this. He is now the veteran, and he is going to, show the young whippersnappers.
But he also has to confront, his own guilt over Goose's death, his penchant for, secrecy and sort of dishonesty in dealing with Goose's son. He has to improve as part of the process as well.
Yeah, I was actually very pleased to see it nominated for a screenplay award,
yeah.
Adapted, because I thought, even though it's a little weird to say it's adapted from the previous movie, it's we call that a sequel. But I thought the story was great. I thought it was beautifully constructed for many of the reasons that you just pointed out, which is not something I think that we're used to seeing from action movies. Many of them are great. I think The Hunt for Red October is a near perfect screenplay. Love that movie, as listeners know. But it was nice to see a movie like this where there was real creative effort put into making it something more than just a movie with very cool planes flying around.
Yeah, and it's it's not a complicated story, right? It's very simple, but it's artful. It's it's a classy picture.
Yeah, it
right?
is. It is. Is it? Do you think that the argument that Top Gun Maverick saved the box office is overblown, or is that a real thing?
I think that moviegoing is a habit, right? And for most Americans, it's not a habit they indulge in very often. And what was really dangerous about the pandemic, from a cinematic perspective, is that it breaks that habit. I'm someone who, I go to the movies generally at least once a week, in a theater. And, part of what was so bizarre about that first year of the pandemic for me, some friends and then my husband and I rented out a theater for the four of us to see Tenet. And we wore masks in the parking lot.
Because that was one of the first ones back.
20 rows away from each other. But it was, having that sort of loneliness of the movies. And so, I don't think, obviously the habit wasn't entirely broken for people who go to Marvel movies or DC movies or whatever. But I think Top Gun played a valuable role in sort of dusting off that habit for people who were not necessarily inclined to go to one of the, really, really, really pre-established ongoing franchises.
Right.
So I think that was really valuable.
Speaking of Tom Cruise, what do you think of when you think of the Mission Impossible franchise and situating it in the genre, which it clearly is in the genre of spy movies, but I think those movies kind of perfectly balance between spy and action film because so many times action films are or action movies that want to say they're a spy movie are just actually action movies, right? And this balances it. So how do you think of that franchise kind of in the, it's a big question, but the pantheon of espionage films?
I love it, but it's also very much part of a modern trend of espionage movies that are about the sort of survival or integrity of the institution itself, untethered from any larger national interest, right?
Yeah.
So, the Mission Impossible movies are not really about America anymore, right? They're about the Impossible Missions Division.
Right.
The James Bond movies are, I loved the Daniel Craig Bond era. I think that Casino Royale and Skyfall are both pretty perfect movies. But those movies are about James Bond's psyche and sort of MI6 and its position in a waning British Empire. The Avengers movies and are about S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers as an institution, there's no sense of national identity in those movies really at all, you know. And to a certain extent, you know, I think that's always been true in spy fiction, right? I mean, we love John le Carré because the world of the circus is sort of self-contained in and of itself, but it is still, you know, anchored in an idea of Britishness, right? And like the Impossible Mission Force has nothing in particular to do with Americanness at this point.
Right.
You know, James Bond has, you know, very little to do with a larger sense of Britishness, especially in sort of the post-imperial era. And so I love it. I mean, look, I love those movies.
Yeah.
Like, I will watch Tom Cruise do any truly insane thing.
Yes.
It's like, and I'm sure this is all in service of like, you know, Dianetics and like persuading us. It's like, if only we two could go clear, like we could hang off the side of an airplane, right? So
he's going to win his first Oscar for stunts. They're going to create that category. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Like L. Ron Hubbard will like be beamed back down from the spaceship onto the Oscar stage, et cetera. And so, yeah, I mean, they're just tremendously enjoyable. But if you think about modern action movies, you know, the John Wick franchise is in some ways so much more kind of like rounded in a fleshed out, you know, cultural milieu and ideology than any of our modern spy franchises.
Interesting. I love this idea, too, that it's, you know, in the Bond movies, especially, well, really all the Bond movies, you're right, but I mean, they're disconnected from an idea necessarily of national interest. It's more sort of, it's good and evil, and I suppose that makes them more broadly appealing to an audience. But that does seem to fit better with kind of, I guess, like, you know, how Americans think about the world these days. Like, I think for instance, I don't watch the, what am I thinking of? The Jack Ryan franchise on Amazon. So I don't know if that's like deeply rooted like in an America fuck yeah kind of context. Yeah. But like I just don't feel like that idea would come over maybe as well. There may be other shows I'm overlooking that do have more of a patriotic streak to them, but it just feels like just this very cool entity that plays by its own rules. Like, not that it's anti-patriotic, but that it's, you know, it's self-contained, right?
Yeah, and look, I think that is, you know, we were talking about how Hollywood is determined not to anger overseas censors, overseas audiences. I think that's very much a domestic play, right? I mean, if you have a spy who is too rooted in a particular idea of what patriotism means or what the American ideal is at a time when there is very little consensus about that. And when, you know, America as a whole has not really sort of honed its self-image in a great power conflict that is sort of intellectual and ideological as well as military. I mean, I think that's a political risk domestically. If you want, you know, if you're making something that's primarily for American audiences, you want to get as much of that audience as possible. Right. And you know, I think the very, very sort of fractured, anxious American self-image doesn't, you know, if Tom Cruise wants to like personally pull us all together and figure that out, you know, good on him. But I think even that is a harder stunt than, you know, jumping your motorcycle off a cliff. For
sure. Obviously, the Oscars can do a lot for films that maybe people hadn't seen very much, and they can boost it into national and international attention. All Quiet on the Western Front, already a pretty heralded movie. I don't know how many people actually saw it, but probably now that it's won so many Oscars, we'll want to go see it.
We have no idea because it's on Netflix and they just make up their numbers.
Well, see, that's
not fair of me.
Well, they reflect on that a little bit.
So Netflix and a lot of the other streaming services, you know, for those of us who grew up with like some access to traditional set-top television, you know, you got a pretty good estimate of how many people were watching something on any given night, thanks to what was known as the Nielsen ratings. Like, I can't believe I'm explaining this as a historical artifact.
We have to now.
We old.
They would pay you money to watch TV.
Yes, they would pay you money to watch TV. And, you know, the Nielsen Corporation had this sort of representative sample of American households. And, you know, there were like actual physical devices in your house that measured like what you were watching and when and how much of it. Now, the streaming companies technically have access to much more granular data than that, right? If you were not a Nielsen family, you know, you were represented by someone else in the Nielsen sample, and so Nielsen was extrapolating about what you were probably watching. Netflix knows like every minute of your shameful habits, right? But, Netflix and the other streaming companies don't release, X million people watch this show. Instead, they release, X million people watch the first 2 minutes. Or, this season was watched for, 47 million cumulative minutes over 31 days excluding Wednesdays, right? And so there, our sense of what anyone is watching at a given time is incredibly fragmented. And I think that, I think the atomization of mass culture thanks to streaming is honestly kind of a social problem, which is a totally different discussion at some point. But, so I have no idea how many people watch All Quiet on the Western Front. Like I understand that it was kind of beloved of the craft guilds. You could see that in the precursor awards running up to the Academy Awards. But I have no idea how many people actually watched All Quiet on the Western Front.
It's such an interesting reflection, too, on the way people are watching. Because so I stumbled on that movie through my Netflix queue. I was not aware of it having been released. I did not. When I stumbled over it, I didn't know that it was a current release. I thought, oh, somebody made a movie a couple years ago about this great book. Oh, I'll check it out.
Netflix bought it. Okay.
Right. Had no clue where it sat, and started watching it and then immediately realizing, oh, no, this is something different. This isn't like a slap-together film. But I actually watched it in installments, which is something I rarely ever do with a feature film, and still found it really satisfying. I watched it over 3 different periods, which, I mean, maybe helped in the sense that like the movie is very intense and you can maybe, not that it's like I have a problem sitting through nearly 3 hours of it, but it was such an interesting way to see it. And I wasn't, I'm just not accustomed to watching features that way. And I wonder if it's like the Netflix influence on my watching habits. It's just like making me maybe more inclined to break up a movie that way. I loved that movie. I mean, I thought it was, I have not read the novel, I should say.
Oh, really? Okay, that's interesting. Because one of the things that was interesting for me is the movie excises a section of the novel where the main character goes home and finds himself sort of unable to acclimate to domestic society.
Interesting.
And trading that for the sort of intercut sequences, which are also not in the novel, of the German negotiators sort of finalizing the ceasefire that ends World War I, it's geopolitically interesting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's, when you have Daniel Bruhl come in as your lead negotiator and he's all sensitive and handsome and German,
right?
It's sort of exculpatory. It's like
interesting.
Y'all started this thing. Like
right.
This is y'all's expansionist problem, right? It's
right.
But Daniel Bruhl's so dreamy and he wants to end the conflict. Right?
So nice. He just has a way out.
Yeah, exactly. And so that the decision, not that the movie is removed from the question of human suffering. In fact, it arguably sort of revels in it.
Yeah.
But it moves you away from the sort of social cost of the war for Germany, right? Because, there are, you have a generation of people. I mean, it's not just that, you have an astonishing proportion of young German men who die in the First World War. And the ones who come home are really, really damaged in a lot of ways, physically, emotionally. I don't know if you've watched Babylon Berlin.
Love that show.
Yeah, unbelievable. But you see, sort of the widespread costs of people who are suffering from shell shock and mental illness and trauma in a society that's totally unequipped to deal with those maladies. And so I found it finely made, but a little unnerving, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to know that the negotiation scenes are not part of the novel.
No.
To me, that's what makes the movie. It gives it a different kind of another layer, which is these very powerful men, negotiating, and obviously they contrast it with this horrible life in the trenches and these guys who are having lovely pastries and coffee and tea, and it's all civilized. And so we're meant to feel like our fates are being decided by these people at great remove, which that made it feel very contemporary.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if the novel has that kind of level of awareness about power dynamics or not, but that, to me, that made the movie just hyper relevant for an audience today, and might explain why it was so popular.
Maybe.
And visually, as a war movie, it's incredible.
It's the most movie, right?
Oh my God.
I mean, There's a joke that my friend Peter Suderman likes to make that, the award for best sound is traditionally awarded to the movie with the most sound. And, this is very much a case of like All Quiet on the Western Front is perhaps the most movie.
Yeah. I think it felt very much in the Saving Private Ryan vein to like pull from another, Oscar-winning war film where not that, well, I should back up on that. When Saving Private Ryan came out, I loved that movie. I do kind of buy the Harvey Weinstein argument that it's two movies. It's like the first movie is 28 minutes of the first scene and then the rest of the movie. And I like both of them except for the ending is too schmaltzy. But there was something about when that movie came out. Yes, it felt important because it was showing violence in war in a way that hadn't been depicted before and it was honest. There was also something that felt a little gimmicky about it. And like that's just like a very cynical read maybe on my part because I think like even D-Day survivors looked at that and they were like, I can't watch this. This is too accurate. But that did kind of mark a moment, it felt like to me in movie making with war movies where if you're going to do a war movie, like it has to be hyper realistic. There has to be like the guy carrying his arm that just got blown off, right? It can't just be people flying through the air and falling over when they're shot.
Yeah. Did you watch 1917?
I did, yes. Yeah.
Really fine lead performance in that too. Yeah. That might actually be superior to the one in All Quiet, but they're both strong.
Yeah, but I think that did we cross a threshold, do you think, like with Saving Private Ryan,
Probably.
where all those movies have to be that way?
Yeah, and to a certain extent, it's, there's the technical capacity to do it and to, filmmaking is a technical business, and we haven't really talked about Avatar at all. Not quite on theme, but, you start getting these people who take these swings to make things possible, right? I mean, Gone with the Wind, whatever else you feel about that movie, the Battle of Atlanta sequence is, for the time, an incredible technical marvel in showing the horror of the aftermath of a battle. Saving Private Ryan is, obviously immersive about combat in a way that something isn't before. And so, I don't think All Quiet really reinvents anything, but it does it quite well. Yeah.
It gets to the question, too, that I want to go back to something you raised earlier, which is this whole notion of accuracy, right? It's particularly in the spy genre. And, I think a lot about this because I write about intelligence for a living. I've been doing this for 20 years. And, I can point out all the things about Homeland that are not how things work, right? Or I can watch a movie and say, like, that's not the way. You made, the kind of the joke about whether the elevator button is the correct color. So what do you think? I mean, when you notice something that is inaccurate, does it disrupt your enjoyment of a film, or is that kind of beside the point to you?
That's really interesting. I think it often depends on how the inaccuracy is being used, right? I mean, if it's a technical detail, it doesn't, for example, in The Last of Us, saying it's like this mountainous region is like right outside of Boston. It's like, come on, I'm silly. Like that's goofy. Like, right. It's like, you got to drive further to get to the Berkshires, and they're the Berkshires, right? Like, they're not the Alps.
Right.
And so, I think I periodically find it distracting. I think it's sort of what is the purpose? There's a difference between an error and a distortion, and what's the purpose of the distortion, right? So, I think a lot of people found I forget who the director is. It's leaving my brain. There's a recent movie about Stonewall that comes out, and it's like puts like a cute white cis boy on sort of the front lines, the whole thing. Right. And I think a lot of people found that pretty grotesquely offensive. Yeah. Like that swap. Both not serving a particular narrative purpose, why not invest in one of these other protagonists, and sort of politically squicky, right? It's like,
and also, we don't need to do that now. Like, we know what the real story of Stonewall is.
And this is a recent movie, right? Exactly. Like, this is not lengthy. And so, it's sort of like what I was saying earlier about art being a place where we kind of say unsayable things. And, art can be used to that end to lie, too, right? To distort. And so I think it's very case by case for me. I'm not super interested in like technical accuracy for accuracy's sake, but I am interested in sort of what purpose distortions serve.
This kind of makes me think about when Zero Dark 30 came out, right? And the whole debate around it, whether is this movie saying torture works insofar as torture led to the discovery of Osama bin Laden's location. I have to admit, I saw that movie, and maybe I just don't recall coming away feeling like it was making a clear-cut argument, which actually made me think that that was a weakness in the story, that it was somehow not clear about, like, are you taking a stand on this or not? I mean, I think in the narrative, it is saying that, but for this information that had been extracted, I think that if I remember the narrative sequence correctly, what they find that leads them to bin Laden is a product of some torture along the way.
So I've watched Zero Dark 30 a lot, in part because I was writing about it as a critic at the time and got embroiled in some of the debates about this. I've probably seen Zero Dark 30 10 times. I love that movie. And that opening section of the movie is ambiguous, right? I mean, it opens with the really intense torture of this detainee. But he starts talking not after he does not break in a torture session, right? He doesn't start spilling out information. He begins to cooperate after the torture stops. There's a scene where I think he's peeling an orange or something.
Yeah.
And he's out in the sunshine. It's, and I think the movie is ambiguous on that score, right? I mean, does he respond because the torture made him receptive to kindness by the people who had imprisoned him? Does torture not in fact work? And in fact, this other, this other approach is what was ultimately successful and important. I don't know that I necessarily see that as a weakness of the movie necessarily, because to me, Zero Dark 30 is a larger argument about self-inflicted moral injury, right? And to a certain extent, it doesn't matter whether it worked. What matters is that we convinced ourselves that this kind of self-inflicted damage was necessary. We, our leaders asked people to do this on our collective behalf. And those people did it instead of saying no. And, Jessica Chastain's character is destroyed by the experience.
Right.
And you're left to decide whether that was worth it for her or for anybody else. I don't know. What was September 11th like for you? Where were you?
Oh gosh, so I mean, it was weird because I was actually on vacation. I was working at Government Executive for our mutual friend Anne Laurent, and I remember it was the first proper vacation I had ever taken as a working person, as a working professional. And so I went out to LA and was visiting friends, and I was actually out in Palm Springs on 9/11, and it was this completely out of body feeling because it was happening in part where I lived, and also all of my colleagues were immediately jumping in and covering it. And it's kind of a funny thing to think about now, but we didn't have super easy remote internet access in 2001. I had to go to an internet cafe to try to check my email and try to stay back in touch. And so it felt like it was happening far away and that I was kind of missing out on the story. Now, that had passed in 4 or 5 days, and I got back and was thrown into writing about it. But, that was the event that put me on track to be a national security journalist, because I was writing about the technology industry and technology in government. And almost overnight, that whole space became infused with ideas about surveillance, cybersecurity, information sharing, intelligence gathering, and that technology was going to provide a solution to this problem of terrorism, which was then very interesting to watch how, in those early days, everyone was very high on the ideas that computers were going to fix the problem because we're just going to put together all the information that we have about the terrorists, then we'll see where they're coming from. Which is why when the torture debate came along, it was such a mind shift because now you're getting into a whole other, this is not a solutions-based dynamic.
ChatGPT can't tell you where Osama bin Laden is hiding.
Precisely. And it really laid bare, kind of the divisions between technical intelligence and signals intelligence, which is a huge part of what the intelligence community does, and human intelligence, which was the thing that was lacking. I mean, the CIA did not have enough people who spoke Arabic and Pashto. They didn't have operatives in Afghanistan and all these places. And so there was this real sense that of just huge desperation because the CIA in particular knew how very far behind the curve it was. And, as you remember too, I mean, we we were all convinced the next attack was coming any day,
Yeah.
and we were just blind.
No, I mean, I was a senior in high school when it happened, and there was someone told me that, a plane had hit the World Trade Center. It's like, that's not real. And there was a TV on in the teacher's lounge, and I went in there and watched it. And I went to English class. So I was living in the Boston area, and as you know, planes were out of Logan. And so my English teacher walked into class hysterical because her husband was on a morning flight out of Logan to LA, and he was on the one of those 3 flights that was not hijacked. My sophomore year social studies teacher, his wife was a flight attendant, and she'd switched shifts with her best friend so she could have a root canal, and her friend died.
Oh my God.
And I got my first cell phone because I had to go on a high school debate trip 8 days later. And Mom was like, if the planes are going down, you are on the phone to your mother.
Wow.
But it's interesting to me that when I think about September 11th, I don't think about Osama bin Laden that much, right? And I remember just how sensational that news was, but I don't entirely know what it means, right? Long term. I don't, and so to me, in some ways, Zero Dark 30 becomes a greater movie with distance because, at the time that it came out, the assassination of bin Laden was still, sort of fresh. And I feel like it's so tacky to say that it was exciting, but it was exciting.
Oh,
right?
and the filmmakers got incredible access from the CIA because the administration was falling all over itself to tell this story to every journalist and to a filmmaker of Catherine Bigelow's renown.
Well, and look, it was a story that was sort of entwined with Hollywood from the beginning, right? Like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson breaks the story nationally, right? People forget about this, that he knew a bunch of Marines and he tweeted it.
Is that how it broke?
It's like him and our mutual friend Keith Urban.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. It's like, this is what, it's like Dwayne Johnson is like, we got bin Laden, people.
God, I forgot that. Yeah. That's wild.
And so it's, it's a story that is by nature cinematic, that, is tied up, ends up incidentally tied up with Hollywood. But I don't know what the assassination of bin Laden means to me today.
Yeah, and to me, you're putting your finger on something too, which has always been interesting to me, which is that there really aren't that many movies about 9/11.
No.
There are very few movies that are directly about 9/11. I think World Trade Center, the Oliver Stone film, which is kind of terrible.
Yeah.
There's the incredible documentary by the French filmmakers.
Flight 93.
Right. Yeah. Flight 93 is actually might be, it's so good just on its own that I wonder if maybe people thought we're just not going to do it.
Yeah, but also
movie.
That's a movie I don't think I can watch. I haven't actually watched that movie. I don't think I can.
It's really hard. It's really, really hard. Although it's incredibly tastefully done, but it's really hard. But you're right. It's not an event. It's not an event that it gets portrayed in film a lot. It's kind of adjacent in some ways to certain stories. But Zero Dark 30, to kind of go back to the America fuck yeah thing, it's not to say that movie is triumphalist. Because as you point out, the Jessica Chastain character who is kind of this
It ends with her weeping. It ends with her feeling empty, right?
Yeah. She's kind of wrecked by it.
And I think that there was an interest. It was a movie. Look, I love Catherine Bigelow. I think she's incredible. I think The Hurt Lockers, maybe, I don't know. It's a less flawed movie, but it's a less great one.
I agree with that.
And, I think there was an interest in promoting the synergy. It was very much a product of, it was released, inevitably alongside these other conversations about the war on terror and about, bin Laden's death specifically. But it really, the reason I say that I think it gets greater with time is because I think that sense of moral ruin and emotional hollowness was very ahead of its time, right? I think that it was discussed as a product of its time, but made, if not for eternity, sort of for the long term in a way that I think the immediate discussion about it couldn't quite capture.
Yeah, you're making me think too that Zero Dark 30 is in some ways it's a superb spy movie, right, for that period. I mean, it's wonderful in that also it's capturing the CIA at a moment where it becomes a paramilitary organization, but it's also dependent on the human tradecraft of intelligence gathering. They show that really, really well. But as you put it, like the emotional hollowness, the way that it destroys her character and empties her out, that's kind of what happens to George Smiley in many ways, right? And Tinker Tailor and in the Le Carre.
And I mean, I think one of the reasons, I think the best spy stories get at the fact that there is something sort of fundamentally immoral about the work, and that the people who are masters of it, at least in fiction, are themselves unusual in some way, right? I mean, you have the total sort of remorseless dedication and kind of non-personness of Jessica Chastain's character in Zero Dark 30. In Le Carre's George Smiley books, you have this person who has this unbelievable capacity to take pain, as represented by, his wife Anne's infidelities, but also this ability to be unbelievably patient in the long game to achieve this victory over Carla. Again, he's someone who has a different sort of threshold for personal dignity and his willingness to sacrifice that. And it's what makes him, queasy, but so watchable. And I think Gary Oldman embodied that so amazingly in, the semi-recent Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, adaptation, which is just so unbelievably satisfying.
It's such a great movie.
Right? And part of what's amazing about that is that the arch spy ends up being the person, not the person who is most genteel, not the person who is, sort of best at blending in his environment or whatever. He's the invisible man. He's the man in the gray flannel suit. He wins by being the most self-abnegating. Right?
And I love that I think people who love to sort of bash on Hollywood and it's all of its moralizing, and Hollywood does make lots of moralizing, preachy films. Spy movies are the place where they can really embrace the immorality, like you said, of what espionage really is. I mean, it is stealing, it's cheating, it's lying, it's deception. Now if it's done in the name of your side, we feel better about it. But Michael Hayden, the former CIA director, I mean, he's talked about this before. He said, in documentaries, he said, we steal secrets. That's our job. We're thieves. And it's such a richer terrain as a writer to play in than trying to make everybody about fighting the good fight, which those are satisfying stories.
But at the same time, the glamorization of immorality plays a moral role in society, right? I mean, by making the case for the continued necessity of this level of immorality, what do we countenance? What do we? Right. And in a way, sort of the more nuanced and serious you are about it, the more successful you are at that moral end, right? I mean, I think something like Breach, which is, a movie that, I think is really successful in part because it's so mundane, right? And Chris Cooper is so queasy as Robert Hansen, right? I mean, that's a movie that's really sort of radically deglamorized. And Ryan Philippe, who I think is not, typically treated as a great actor, gives an incredible performance as someone who's just who's being asked to do something that is both necessary and just sickening to do over and over again.
Because he's spying on his boss, basically.
Well, he's not just spying on his boss, but he's trying to sort of ingratiate himself with this person who is unpleasant, who is socially awkward. And the whole framework of the movie is just grubby and gray. It is, sort of the essence of its color palette. And so a movie like that, I think gets at it both, Robert Hansen needed to be caught, but, the system that he needed to be caught in part because he exploited the system that we've set up to, to do bad things on our behalf. It's, that movie is just about the sort of ultimate Matryoshka doll of intelligence. It just there's always a layer where it's you're doing something bad because you're doing something good. Totally. So you need to do something bad in order. It's and
there are shows that have done this so successfully. I think of are The Bureau, which is marvelous, and The Americans. I mean, and maybe the Americans is even the better example. I mean, I did you watch the whole series?
Yeah.
So when we got to the end of that, we've had Joe Weisberg on the show before, who created the show. I remember so desperately wanting something for the protagonist to be punished. I wanted them to suffer because, I mean, you're both rooting for them, both as parents and as spies, even though, which is kind of like, a mind twist, of course, because they're the bad Russian spies. What's going on? But the choices that they make are so devastating to so many people, including their family, not to mention all the people they murder along the way, that the ending of that...
Poor Martha.
I know, God, there needs to be a sequel about Martha.
Justice for Martha.
I pitched Joe Weisberg on this idea. I was like, you need to have a spinoff about Martha. He's like, there are 3 people who are behind this idea. Me, my show creator, and you. Everybody else says no. But I loved the ending of that, of Paige getting off the train and then being separated. Because I thought to myself, like, A, good for Paige, but B, like, yeah, you deserve it. You're terrible people, right? And I love that show made you, on the same time, root for them, at the same time that you're hoping for their ruin.
No.
And that is something that, those are emotions that the espionage drama or genre can play with in ways that I just don't think others can do it so easily.
No. Well, and it's that is one of the only examples where I think the anti-hero works, the anti-hero dynamic works the way it's intended to, right? Where, their competence is amazing within the sort of hermetically sealed world of their marriage. You can root for them, but, you can never stop counting the costs, right? Like, they're never so awesome that you're like, fuck yeah, Mr. White. Like, you can't have, there's no version of that show there's no way to watch that show where it's like, Tony Soprano murdering people is just awesome, and I'm going to let everything else go.
Right. Do you have a favorite spy movie?
Oh boy, that's tricky. I don't know that I don't rank things generally. I do another podcast, Across the Movie Aisle, with Peter Suderman and Sonny Punch, and they always make me do a top 10 list at the end of the year. And I always just completely half-ass it and throw it together at the end. And often we'll like cheat and, have ties and revise in show. I think for sort of recent stuff, the Tinker Tailor adaptation and then The Americans are pretty hard to beat. I mean, if nothing else, just the ending, that solitary tear of blood, La Mer, triumph of George Smiley, just unbeatable.
It's pretty great.
That melding of like, your victory is someone's tragedy.
Sometimes I think rather than try to create a top 10, the question is better of like, what's a movie that if it's on, you'll just drop anything and watch it?
Yeah.
Right? I feel like Hunt for Red October is that way for me. If Zero Dark 30 were on, I'd watch it too. And I feel like I could watch it, I could pick it up like any point in the middle, beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all good.
Yeah. Casino Royale, right?
Yeah. Who do you think should be the next Bond?
Oh, boy. Well, and the bigger question is, like, what should the next Bond be, right? Because you've had an argument, like this recent stretch of Bond movies is an argument for Bond's obsolescence, right? It's like the empire he serves is crumbling and being held to accountability. He is ultimately in a situation where, like, Bond himself is forced to become an attached figure, right? It's like he has a child. He is sort of wrenched away from that sort of necessary expendability, and the thing that he has to do to save that child is sacrifice himself. So what should Bond be? Like, and that's a question. What is espionage? What is spying in the modern era? And one thing I think has been really interesting about Hollywood's indebtedness to China is that it means that the contemporary spy movie has not adapted to the new great power game, right? I mean, we don't have movies with Chinese villains because they can't be sold abroad and because they would have consequences for other movies made by the studios who want to sell movies abroad. But we have no cinematic argument about what the clash of ideologies between the Chinese Communist Party and the U.S. looks like. We have no, mass fictional model for, Chinese spies versus American spies. We have none of those sort of locales. We have none of those, we don't even, to the extent that there is a vision of, a playing field that includes, Africa or South America or any of the places where sort of Belt and Road efforts are happening. It's like, here's a location flashed randomly on the screen at the beginning of a Bond movie or an Avengers movie, or, it's American pop culture has not adapted to the new circumstances. It is silent on this subject.
Right.
And, to a certain extent, I think that's because, we don't have sort of national events like the Berlin Airlift that have clarified the differences in national approaches, right? I mean, if you look at the coverage of Chinese couples who aren't having kids, the reasons that they say they're doing it are literally indistinguishable from what American couples say about making the same decision. Like, we don't have those contrasts sharply delineated and part of our conversation yet, even though that sort of seems like where this is all heading. And Hollywood, a different version of Hollywood, could be a place where we work out some of those questions.
Do you think it's likely that that's going to happen? And B, will that look like some filmmaker or studio just saying, you know what, we're going to make a movie that is never going to show in China, but we're going to make something that was reflecting the conflict as we see it? Because we all Americans, to a great degree, and particularly people of our generation, experienced the Cold War through movies, through popular culture. That's how we interpreted what was going on.
Yeah, and I mean, Netflix has never competed in China, right? They just decided that was not worth their while. They submit to censorship requests from a lot of other countries like India, Saudi Arabia, et cetera. But they're sort of the place that could do it, although given the sort of issues with their plateauing subscriber growth, we'll see where that happens.
Yeah.
But I would love to see someone make a geopolitical horror movie about a foreign power that creates an app that it uses to poison an entire country's brains, right? Like, TikTok is horror movie is like an obvious techno thriller, right? Like,
Totally.
It's like it's like this app convinced all American teenagers that they have tics or eating disorders or whatever.
Right.
I would what does American spycraft, what does The Great Game look like when it's American and Chinese spies playing in Nigeria? I have no idea. I would be super interested to watch that, right?
Right.
It's like, does the American political system and the freedom it offers have the kind of appeal that it does, that, for Chinese spies at a time when the regime has, dramatically raised standards of living and where the U.S. has been through the Iraq War and the financial crisis. I mean, these are questions that, if explored on film, would help us work out our self-image.
Yeah.
And there's an extent to which, it's not like Hollywood has ever been high-minded when there are not really profits or something to be made of it. But, I would like to see the entertainment that comes of working out those issues, because it's probably a conversation we could stand to have, right?
Yeah.
I mean, for the love of God, you have the only good thing that Donald Trump did was the creation of the Space Force, right?
Right.
Because there's going to be great power competition in space in our lifetimes.
Yes.
That's going to be a real thing, right? I mean, how do you not have someone doing comedy that's about the Chinese balloon, right?
Of course, it's so perfect,
right? And it's we could have dueling space satellites in our lifetimes, and the greatest special effects machine in history isn't taking advantage of this stuff. Come on!
And it's amazing to me that we have there is a show about the great power battle in space, but it's for all mankind. It's an alternate history about us and the Russians.
Yeah.
The actual battle in space would of course be about the U.S. and China. I mean, it's playing out right now.
Yeah, well, you can get some of this stuff. I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy. One of the things that's really interesting about it is that it just assumes that different countries will be very important in this kind of great power conflict in space. When he wrote those books, China was totally out of the equation. You end up with a bunch of, Shinto Japanese settlers and the Swiss parachuting in and being we're just going to mediate for the entire galaxy, right? It's you have big, corporations. But, these questions are interesting, right? It's like, what happens if, a culture that's not American ends up settling Mars? What happens, what does space warfare actually look like? What does the great game look like if the competition is to do we get carbon out of Congo's forests or keep it in the ground, right? I don't know the answer to any of these questions. Pop culture could help us sort it out and have a lot of fun doing it. And
I think so too. And I think it's going to take some journalists probably covering a lot of this and people who've worked, frankly, like ex-intelligence officers probably writing books about it to start explaining the storylines to people in Hollywood who themselves, I'm sure this is as opaque to most people as it is to your typical Hollywood screenwriter.
Yeah, but it's not like some of this stuff hasn't been covered, right?
True.
The Wall Street Journal had a big piece recently about how a lot of the Belt and Road infrastructure that China has financed and helped build abroad is falling apart because it's terrible.
Right.
And so, how about something like a dam that's about to, you can do a set piece with a Belt and Road dam that's about to fall apart, right? There's real cheap and easy opportunities for pro-American propaganda on the ground.
Somebody's going to pick this idea up and hire you.
I
consult for us? Put out a USAID contract on the slide.
Do you want me to just I will read the newspaper for you for money.
Right.
Sure.
It's like The Player. It's like Robert Altman's The Player. Right? You just read the newspaper. All the stories are right here. Why do we have a writing department?
Exactly.
I love it.
Exactly.
So our tradition on Chatter is that our last question is I reach in here to the Chatter box, which is here live and in person. And I'm going to ask you a pre-written question selected at random.
Oh, my gosh.
Here we go. Okay. All right. Oh, this is actually a good one.
Okay.
This is a good one for you, I think. What common misperception about your profession or specialty makes your blood boil?
Well, let's talk about opinion journalists specifically.
Okay.
Because I think there is a sense that, it's just a job where you sit around and spout off.
Right.
And I think, and there are people in the profession who do that. But opinion journalism is full of curious, insecure weirdos, right? And to a certain extent, it's one of the best jobs on the planet because you can be I'm curious about this thing. I want to go down a rabbit hole. You don't have to be tethered to events that other people are controlling. You can just say I'm really interested in how you teach kids to read, or I have gotten interested in this period of American history that people don't pay a lot of attention to. And I think the stuff that people read in opinion journalism is sort of overwhelmingly about politics. And that's a shame because there's, someone like Jessica Gross is doing really interesting work on motherhood and middle age at the New York Times. Opinion journalism also takes place at places that are not just the New Yorker, right? So, or at the New York Times or the Washington Post. So, Amy Davidson Sorkin at the New Yorker, writes these incredibly sort of elegant, crisp opinion columns for Talk of the Town that are just a pleasure to read and sort of, a perfect example of the form. And so I think the idea that opinion journalism is all about politics and the idea that it's a bunch of people sitting around with their shoes on the desk being all right, folks, let me tell you what's what.
Right.
When in fact it's a much weirder and more expansive field, and that's one of the reasons it's really fun to work in it.
Well, and one that I think after people listening to this conversation will appreciate is one in which the writers like you are immersed in their subject. You're doing the work. You're doing your reporting is, and at least on these subjects, is going out. It's seeing these films 10 times. It's thinking about them. It's talking to people about them.
Or it's going to the National PTA Legislative Conference and being there are a bunch of people who are feeding hungry kids in Utah and handing out Narcan in Montgomery County. And it's it's reporting can be really grim and depressing, but it can also just be a kind of, it can be delightful and surprising.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, your work is always those things. And this has been a delight as well. Alyssa Rosenberg, my friend. This was fun. Let's do this again.
Anytime, Shane. Anytime.
Movies, aliens, you name it. All right. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.